Deuteronomy 13. Israel is across the Jordan and the plains of Moab, waiting to inherit the promised land. And now Moses, in the book of Deuteronomy, is preaching a series of sermons, okay, to the people of Israel, and he's called them to be faithful. That's what we kind of looked at the last few weeks. He's called them to be faithful to the Lord their God. He calls them to commit to his word. I mean, that really is faithfulness in our day and age. This is how God speaks, by looking at his word. He calls them to commit to his word, what he had revealed at that point in time, to commit to his word and to remember his works. And he reviews, in chapter 5, he reviews the 10 commandments, and he talks about the motivation for keeping them. And he preached about passing that on to the next generation, just to remind you of kind of where we left off last week. Deuteronomy 6:4. I think it's appropriate to read this again. Hear, O Israel, the Lord is our God. The Lord is one. You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul and with all your might. These words which I am commanding you today shall be on your heart. You shall teach them diligently, repeatedly. Remember that word shanan, right? Like the sharpening of a tool or the sharpening of a blade. You shall repeatedly teach them. Teach them diligently to your sons, and shall talk of them when you sit in your house, and when you walk by the way, and when you lie down, and when you rise up. I spent a whole semester on one verse, this verse, in my last year in seminary. And the beginning of the semester, I was like, oh man. You know, it's like I had to write like a 25 or 30-page paper on one verse. How in the world do you write 25 pages on one verse? And by the end of the semester, I had to ask for 5 extra pages. I mean, there's just so much here, such a rich passage Jesus quotes over and over again. Today, we skip ahead to chapter 13. Now, I told you guys I was not going to be preaching through the entire book of Deuteronomy. I was going to be hand-selecting. I've selected about 15 passages I want to look through in Deuteronomy. Here we are in Deuteronomy 13. And in today's passage, Moses tells Israel how to recognize and handle false prophets. Oh, do we have false prophets out there today? Let me give you a word of caution, and it's a word of caution you've heard from me, and people who are watching from home or listening from home or whatever. Do not find your teachers on the internet. Now, I know that sounds kind of, right? They're on the internet listening to me saying, don't find your teachers on the internet, all right? And the reason why I say that is most of these guys on the internet, they're not peer reviewed. They're not called by God to lead a church. They're not necessarily qualified. They're not being trained by qualified men of God who are watching their lives and who are ordaining these men for the work of the ministry and the church approving these guys. They're just guys who are out there teaching whatever. Or in some cases, a guy says, I want to be a pastor of a church, and without any training whatsoever, without anyone looking to see if he is biblically qualified, he just starts a church. Or he just starts a web page or whatever. And so you have all types of quacks out there. And this last year, those guys have done very well on the internet, deceiving people. So don't find your teachers on the internet. All right? If you want to listen to some people, there are some people on the internet that are okay. All right? There are some people on it, they're okay. But don't go looking randomly on the internet for people. All right? They need to be someone who's peer reviewed, someone who's qualified, someone who's a legitimate teacher of the Bible. False teachers abound today. In today's passage, Moses tells Israel how to recognize and handle false prophets. And one way to recognize a false prophet, and he's going to give another one a few chapters later, which we'll look at in a few weeks. One way to recognize a false prophet is by looking at what or whom he worships. Look at verse 1 and 2 here. Let's look at verse 1 and 2. If a prophet or a dreamer of dreams arises among you and gives you a sign or a wonder, and the sign or the wonder comes true concerning which he spoke to you, saying, let us go after other gods, whom you have not known, and let us serve them. Now, we're we're in the middle of the sentence, but I'm just going to let's just stop there. Stop there just for a second. A prophet, I don't typically stop in the middle of a sentence, but we're going to finish the sentence in a second here. A prophet is a mouthpiece for God. So he speaks on behalf of God. He says God's word. Here, if a prophet or a dreamer of dreams arises among you, what does that tell me about this prophet that Moses is writing about? Chad. So this particular prophet, this type of prophet, would come from the nation of Israel. Now in that context, right, you know, people from other lands, they would be worshiping false gods, right? They'd be, you know, the Moabites, the Ammonites, they'd be worshiping like Chemosh and Molech and those guys, right? The Canaanites would be worshiping Baal, and you know, the different places would be worshiping their false gods. So you wouldn't really expect a solid proclaimer of the Lord to come out of the foreign nations. But these are people that come from within the nation of Israel. And so you would expect them to be legitimate. And by the way, sometimes that's how it works today. You got a guy who seems to be, you know, he claims to be a Christian. And he, on the surface, seems to be an okay teacher. And then you look underneath and you're like, whoa, he believes that? He rejects that fundamental of the faith, and so on. Well, anyway, so this guy arises from among the people. He's not a foreign prophet. He comes from within Israel. And that can make him particularly deceptive. It's just like today. If a guy says, yeah, I believe Jesus died and rose from the dead, that can make him deceptive. Or like the Jehovah's Witnesses that used to come to my house, and I'd ask them, does salvation participate? Does your work participate in your salvation? I would ask them, are works part of salvation? And they never answer the question. And they basically say, we're what you are. And I know they're not what I am. But they're deceiving me, or at least they're trying to deceive me. They're particularly deceptive. False teachers can be particularly deceptive. Anyway, this false prophet gives a sign or a wonder. All right, and these signs or wonders may even come true, but that fact in and of itself does not make him legitimate. And so again, if we think about a guy today, we think about, you know, the faith healers today who so-called give a sign, right? Those signs are all false. But they so-called give a sign. That doesn't necessarily make the sign in and of itself, does not make them of God. The prophet's sign or wonder needs to be measured against his message. The prophet's sign or wonder needs to be measured against his message. And that's what we see here. Like, look at the message of the false prophet at the end of verse 2. The message makes it clear that he is not what he says he is. That same principle applies today. If a prophet or a dreamer of dreams arises among you and gives you a sign or a wonder, and the sign or wonder comes true concerning which he spoke to you, saying, let us go after other gods, whom you have not known, and let us serve them. This guy is enticing people to walk away from the Lord. And I'm going to tell you, the people today that we see, or the false prophets today that we see, they're more subtle. But it's the same thing. Because they've created a different God in their mind. And their theology is a completely different God than the God of the Bible. And I'll talk a little bit about the prosperity movement in a few minutes, and a little bit about the faith, what do they call them? Word of faith movement, right? And how their God, and they call him the Lord, and they talk about Jesus Christ, but their God is different. Their God is completely different. Anyway, this guy's encouraging Israel to go after other gods. And this isn't it's not the only way to recognize a false teacher, but in chapter 19 we'll see another one, or chapter 18 we'll see another one. But this is the one I want to focus on today. His message. The false prophet is exposed by his message. In that type of situation, how should Israel respond? Look at verse 3. Now understand that we're looking at the ancient context. the Old Testament economy. So not everything is going to have a 1-to-1 ratio on how to apply today. We'll talk about that a little later. Okay. But anyway, verse 3. You shall not listen to the words of that prophet or that dreamer of dreams. For the Lord your God is testing you to find out if you love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul. Israel was to not listen to the words of that prophet. They were to reject his words. They were to reject his teachings. Yet, this false prophet does display a certain level of signs and wonders. That doesn't make him, and God would allow that to happen, but he would allow that to happen as a test. His signs or wonders, be they real or fabricated, false, fake, are not the determining factor on whether this guy is legit. His message is one of the, not the entire factor, but one of the determining factors. What he believes about God, what he teaches about Jesus Christ in today's context. God was testing Israel, allowing them to display whether or not they would be faithful to the Lord as their one true God. And I believe that same truth applies today. I think that God is testing us by allowing these guys to even breathe and be alive out there. But whatever. God tested them. Look at the language. Look at the purpose for the testing. To find out if you love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul. Deuteronomy 6:7. You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your strength, all your might, all your mind. These words I command to you today. You shall teach them diligently. Did I say Deuteronomy 6:7? Deuteronomy 6:6. Deuteronomy 6:5. Sorry. Deuteronomy 6:5. He's essentially referring back to Deuteronomy 6:5. The Lord is testing you to see if you love the Lord your God. Of course, is it like, let's put Jim Jones out there. And let's find out if these believers really love me. Because I'm not sure if they do. Is that what's going on? Is God like, yeah, let me find out if, let me find out Molly Staley really loves me. Because I'm not sure. Is that, let me find out if Tom Krause, let me find out if Roxanne Leaf, if they really, do they really love me? Because I'm not 100% sure. Is that what's going on here? Of course not, right? Because that would undermine what the scriptures say about God's perfect knowledge of all things. Right, so don't misunderstand this. Of course, God knows all things. This isn't about God as much as it is about Israel. So it's about Israel proving their love for him. Israel's faithfulness or apostasy will stand as a witness not only to the generation that they're living in, but to future generations. Now, again, the situation is not entirely different today. We have all kinds of false teachers out there today, and they're considerably more subtle and considerably more deceptive than the false prophets of Moses' day. There are the faith healers like Benny Hinn, and man, there's a really good documentary on Benny Hinn that was put out there for people and they were interviewing people who were sick and who he quote unquote healed of cancer. And there was one boy whose parents donated all this money, and Benny Hinn healed the boy of cancer, only for the boy to die of cancer like 6 months later. There are the false prophets out there like Benny Hinn. There are the charismatic Pentecostal deceivers that are rampant. Most of Christianity today, I'll use the word evangelical Christianity, that is, people who believe the gospel or proclaim the gospel at some level. Most of those guys are Pentecostal charismatic. Guys like Pat Robertson, and people turn on the television station to TBN or CBN or whatever, right? And they turn on the 700 Club and say, oh, what a godly man. He is a wolf. He is a wolf. And guys like Carl Lentz, who, by the way, we talked about this a couple weeks ago, I think, who was the pastor of Hillsong Church. Hillsong is a wolf, just so you know. But Carl Lentz has now been exposed as having multiple affairs over a year's time, and the church knew about it. The leadership of the church knew about it. He's a wolf. He's a false teacher. He's a false prophet. We didn't need his infidelity to know that. Okay? We could just look at his message and know. We could just look at the songs and know, but some people don't have that. They don't have that wisdom to figure that out, unfortunately. There are the word of faith teachers like Beth Moore, who people love. People love Beth Moore and the Jesus calling movement and the open up your heart and let God speak to you and God really kind of like telling you what to do in your mind and all that. Well, that's not what we see in Scripture. That's not how God's working today. God works through his word today. Such false prophets will claim to hear directly from God. How convenient. Especially when we have a completed canon of Scripture, when we have everything we need for life and godliness through the knowledge of him. They'll claim to have the power to do signs and wonders, and they'll claim to worship the Lord. And yet their message exposes them as false teachers. The message exposes them. Do not listen to the words of that prophet. You shall not listen to the words of that prophet. Don't be deceived by the false message of the Pentecostal charismatic movement, or by the false heresy, apostasy of the Roman Catholic movement, or by the heresy, the false teaching of the mainline denominationals, or the Jehovah's Witnesses, or the Mormons, or whoever, Seventh-day Adventists. Or the internet huckster who acts like he knows what he's talking about. And he doesn't know the first thing about what he's talking about. Don't listen to the words of that false teacher. In Moses' day, Israel was to reject false teachers like that. And in rejecting those false teachers, those false prophets, they were called to faithfulness. Look at verse 4. You shall follow the Lord your God and fear him. I got to get this up high for them to see on the internet, right? They can't see if I have it down low. They could see it up here, right? When it's up high like that. Okay. You shall follow the Lord your God and fear him. And you shall keep his commandments, listen to his voice, serve him, and cling to him. We have a six-fold faithfulness here. Follow the Lord, fear him, keep his commandments, listen to his voice, serve him, cling to him. It's all really just different ways of saying the same thing. It's emphasizing what's going on. 6 different words calling Israel to be faithful to the Lord with all their hearts and their souls and their minds and their strength. We do that today by being faithful to this book. That's how we do it today. This is how we know God today. This is how we know what God wants. This is how we know what pleases him. This is how we know how to identify the false prophets, by reading this book, by studying it in its context. Israel was to reject the false prophets, and they were to mete out judgment against them in verse 5. But that prophet, or that dreamer of dreams, shall be put to death. In the Old Testament economy, in Israel's economy, because remember, Exodus, Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy, these books constituted, and Deuteronomy in particular, constituted Israel's, that is, they were Israel's constitution. Much like the U.S. Constitution is ours today. This is how they would handle it. But that prophet or that dreamer of dreams shall be put to death because he has counseled rebellion against the Lord your God, who brought you from the land of Egypt and redeemed you from the house of slavery, to seduce you from the way which the Lord your God commanded you to walk. So you shall purge the evil from among you. Israel was to put the false prophet to death. Why? Because the false prophet threatened the entire community. And it's not hard to see how that happens. They threatened the entire community if Israel rebelled against God. So if the false prophet is successful, and he leads people astray, and they go after other gods, they become pagans in the promised land. And what happens to pagans in the promised land? They're destroyed, right? They're placed under the ban. And so Israel would ultimately be destroyed and removed from the land because of this false prophet. It's treason, is what it is. It's treason in the Old Testament economy. It's treason. It's undermining God's authority. It's standing against Israel's constitution as a nation of God's people. And in so doing, it's bringing destruction not only upon themselves, but upon the entire nation of Israel. And by the way, they didn't do this enough. And ultimately, Israel would worship other gods, and ultimately, they would be taken away from the land. Of course, if you read the Old Testament, you'll see that. You'll particularly if you read 1st and 2nd Kings, 1st and 2nd Chronicles, Jeremiah, you'll read about that, and other places. Ezra, Nehemiah, Esther, you'll kind of see the end result of some of that. Malachi and some of the post-exilic prophets, Haggai, Zechariah, Malachi. But anyway, the apostate would entice them and have them go after other gods. But the language that's used here at the end of verse 5 is, so you shall purge the evil from among you. The word purge means to destroy. That false prophet is to be destroyed, to be removed from the land of the living. His teachings and his ways needed to be completely eradicated from the land, taken out of the land. He is evil. Now, we do not live under the Old Testament Hebrew economy. What that means is our laws are not God's laws. We live in the land of the free. That is, you're free to think and do whatever you want, no matter how evil it is. And by the way, the tendency that we're taking now as a nation is sin is gaining more and more freedom. Godliness is getting less and less freedom. I fear for what our next administration might try to do against religious liberties, but praise the Lord. Praise the Lord that our current president was able to get 3 people in the Supreme Court, and we already see religious liberty holding up. We had our first Supreme Court case on religious liberty the Wednesday before Thanksgiving, and 5-4 it upheld to maintain religious liberty in the churches in the state of New York. And Amy Coney Barrett is the deciding vote. If RBG was in there, it would have gone the other way. And shame on John Roberts. Shame on that guy who was supposed to be, shame on this guy. He's going to stand before God and answer for the many. This guy is not, he's a wolf. All right, he's not, and I think he was a Bush appointee, So imagine if Hillary would have gotten in. Imagine if 3 Supreme Court justices would have gone the other way. Religious liberties would have, it might be illegal to worship in many places around the country right now, including here. It might be. Now that's a stretch. That's a stretch. But the limitations would have been upheld and perhaps even increased. And with a Supreme Court like that, we would have been in real trouble. The U.S. Constitution is not Israel's Constitution. So don't go applying Israel's Constitution and saying, you don't have the authority. You don't have the authority within our laws to kill a false prophet. And that's not what you're called to do anyway. We'll talk about what the New Testament response is later on. Evil does abound, though, in America, and America calls evil good and good evil. But one day, the Lord Jesus will come back, and he will eradicate all evil. In the Old Testament economy, Israel was to destroy apostate teachers, and it didn't even matter. And this is really kind of the second point I want you to kind of remember. In the Old Testament economy, Israel was to destroy false teachers. And kind of the second idea I want you to put in your mind is this. And it didn't even matter how close of a relationship you have with them. It didn't even matter how close didn't even matter if they were close friends or family members. Look at verses 6 and 7. If your brother, your mother's son, or your son or daughter. It's hard to imagine a much closer relationship in life. There's only one more closer relationship than that in life, than your son or daughter. If your son or daughter, oh, wait a minute, or the wife, the very closest relationship you could possibly have in human relations, right? The only relationship that exists on earth where two become one, right? If your brother, your mother's son or your daughter, or the wife you cherish, the word is literally the wife of your bosom, or your friend who is as your own soul, your very best close friend. Anyone here ever have you have a friend that's so close that he's like closer than even family members? I've experienced that in life. Unfortunately, he died. But anyway, or your friend who is as your own soul. If they entice you secretly, saying, let us go and serve other gods, whom neither you nor your fathers have known, or of the gods of the people who are around you, near you or far from you, from one end of the earth to the other end. And again, I want to stop. I'm making a habit here today of just, I want you to see the if clause, and then after we understand the if clause, we'll go to the then part of it. Okay. Anyway, in verse 6, it doesn't matter how close it is. Notice this little phrase. If your whomever entice you secretly. Isn't that how it works sometimes? Isn't that how it works when there's fear of being known? If the consequences are going to get a person in trouble, well, what do they do next? They're not going to go out and do it publicly. They're going to do it secretly. They're going to do it privately. They're going to do it behind closed doors. They're going to do it in small groups of people that they know and trust. They're going to do it with people who think they have their ear. And that same truth happens today, right? I mean, isn't that how divisive people and evil people in churches work today? They're not going to go out and proclaim in front of everybody. You know, I had one guy one time. He had the right to do it at the time. He was going to make a motion at a meeting. Oh, and the motion was an egregious sin. What he was making the motion on was it was not a good motion. It was exposing. It would expose who he was. And I was like, Pastor Thorne would have been like, oh no, we can't let him make that motion. I was like, oh, everyone's going to see what he is. Finally, everyone's going to see what he, because I'm not going to go out and tell everybody. I can't go out and tell everybody who everybody is. But I'm thinking, yes, I can't believe this guy's going to expose himself like this. And then he never made the motion. And the time came to make the motion because he probably recognized that the way to do this work was to do it secretly. That's how false teachers sometimes work. To be a false prophet in the Old Testament economy would be committing treason. It would be undermining God's authority. And so if you did it publicly, you would be put to death. But if you do it secretly, you might be able to entice your brother or your son or your daughter or your wife. You might be able to lead them astray. The unfortunate situation here is, can you imagine the situation you're putting them in that economy, in the Old Testament economy? Can you imagine the situation you're putting your wife in when you entice her secretly to go worship another god? Her responsibility. She has a responsibility concerning you. And you've just put her in a terrible, terrible situation where she has to choose between doing what God says or doing what you say. And what God says is going to have some terrible consequences even in her life, and certainly in the false prophet's life. Anyway, it's a terrible, terrible situation. Look what is called for in this situation when even your close brother entices you. Verse 8, you shall not yield to him or listen to him And your eye shall not pity him, nor shall you spare or conceal him, but you shall surely kill him. Wow. Your hand shall be the first against him to put him to death, and afterwards the hand of all the people. So the death was done in a merciful way. The justice was done in a merciful way by stoning. So your hand would be cast the first stone, everyone else in the community would cast stones, and you wouldn't really know which stone killed the guy. And so you wouldn't have that on your conscience as an individual. It would be collective. It would be on the collective conscience of the community. I'm not the guy who put him to death. We all put him to death. Okay? So there was still mercy there. So you shall, and the fact that there was individual responsibility, your hand shall be first against him. Why would your hand be the first one? Anyone think why? Because we look and say, man, I don't think I'd want my hand involved at all. I think I just want to try to forget it and not bring it up again. Why your hand, Tom? So he, as a witness, is confirming this is fact. Yeah, right? You hit the nail on the head right there, completely. Look at, let's read verse 10. So you shall stone him to death because he sought to seduce you from the Lord your God, who brought you out of the land of Egypt, out of the house of slavery. Look at Proverbs 1:10. My son, if sinners entice you, do not consent. You don't hide it, you expose it. It's a terrible way to die, but it's done at the hands of the community. And look at the result of the judgment in verse 11. Then all Israel will hear and be afraid and will never again do such a wicked thing among you. A swift judgment against sin is a deterrent to evil. And we see that in, check this out, Ecclesiastes 8:11. Because the sentence against an evil deed is not executed quickly, therefore the hearts of the sons of men among them are given fully to do evil. I kind of like the way the King James reads there. Let me get that open here. Because sentence against an evil work is not executed speedily, therefore the heart of the sons of men is fully set in them to do evil. If you don't, and can we see that's a problem today? People aren't afraid of the law. People sit on death row for 20 years. You know what I mean? What am I afraid of? I'm gonna be able to live for 20 years if I murder someone. It's ridiculous. But anyway, Israel was to destroy false teachers, the apostate teachers. It didn't matter how close they were. And they were even to destroy false cities, even to destroy apostate cities. Look at verses 12 and following. If you hear in one of your cities, which the Lord your God is giving you to live in, anyone saying that some worthless men, by the way, this word worthless men, literally translated, it's literally translated in the King James and New King James. And I don't know if there's any other translation that translates it this way, but they've got it right here. Sons of Belial. Literally sons of Belial. And Belial is another word for Satan. So if you hear in any of your cities, which the Lord your God is giving you to live in, anyone saying that some sons of Belial, some sons of Satan, have gone out from among you and have seduced the inhabitants of their city, saying, let us go and serve other gods whom you have not known. That's a phrase we've seen over and over again, right? Their message is the same. And it doesn't matter whose message it is. It doesn't matter if it's a close friend or family member, or if you've heard of this happening somewhere else. Even if it's a rumor. They're doing this on a much larger scale here in verses 12 and following. Then you shall investigate and search out the matter. Then you shall investigate and search out and inquire thoroughly if it is true And the matter established that this abomination, because that's what it is, that's what apostasy is, that's what false teaching is, it's an abomination. Benny Hinn is an abomination. Pat Robertson is an abomination. The Pope is an abomination. If it is true, and the matter established that this abomination has been done among you, you shall surely strike the inhabitants of that city with the edge of the sword, utterly destroying it, and all that is in it, and its cattle with the edge of the sword. Then you shall gather all its booty, that's spoils of war. You shall gather all its booty into the middle of its open square, and burn the city and all its booty with fire as a whole burnt offering to the Lord your God. And it shall be a ruin forever. It shall never be rebuilt. Nothing from that which is put under the ban. Tell me about the ban. Someone tell me something about the ban. Anyone remember anything about the ban? To put someone under the ban means what? The cursed thing. Anyone remember what's that? It could be what? I'm sorry? An idol. Anyone remember the law of harem? Anyone remember that? To utterly destroy something. To devote to destruction. You are devoting them to God. You're devoting them to destruction to God. To completely wipe them out. Israel would be treated like the pagans in the promised land here. Nothing from that which is put under the ban shall cling to your hand, in order that the Lord may turn from his burning anger and show mercy to you, and have compassion on you, and make you increase, just as he has sworn to your fathers, if you will listen to the voice of the Lord your God, keeping all his commandments which I am commanding you today, and doing what is right in the sight of the Lord your God. Israel would burn that city. It'd be a ruin forever. The people of God would become the people of deserving judgment, and God's people would be the agent of it. Just like the flood was the agent of judgment during the days of Noah, God's people would be the agent of judgment to that city which apostatized. Again, this does not apply the same way in today's economy. This was for the people of Israel within the promised land. It's not something that we should do to lost people. So don't go finding a false teacher and murdering him. That's not New Testament teaching. Okay. Andrew's back there. Man, I was looking for something. In Steve that was wrong, so I could do him away. So don't go committing murder today. But the principle remains in the New Testament. Believers need to be separate from sin. They need to be separate from the lost to a certain extent. We need to be separate from worldliness. We need to be separate from false teachers. Now, how do these verses that we looked at, how does America fit into that? Let's imagine America was on trial today, just for the sake of the argument. America would be wiped out. We would be like that city that is spoken of in verses 14 through 18. Our major cities, every single one of them, New York City, Philadelphia, Detroit, Chicago, LA, Miami, they would be wiped out completely in the Old Testament economy because they call evil good and good evil. They oppose what God says. And our nation as a whole essentially does the same thing. The majority of people who live in our country call evil good and good evil. And if you speak God's words, you're condemned in this world. And so in the Old Testament economy, Israel was to destroy apostates. It didn't matter how close you were to them. And wipe out cities like that, apostate cities. Today, we understand that America's in deep trouble with God. One day we're going to find out how much trouble. For some of you, maybe like Bob, maybe like Tom, maybe some other, the America that exists today is not the America you grew up in. Of course, I don't have to tell you that. You know that. You tell me that, right? It's not the America that you grew up in. It's not even really much of the America that I grew up in. It's changed a lot in the last 20 or 30 years. Now it's changed. Now the America I grew up in is still not the America you grew up in, right? We've just been on a downward spiral. We've just, like, if you're looking at it like a timeline, we've just kind of like a chart of, this is time, and this is good, and down is evil. America's kind of just continued to go slow. I actually think the chart looks like this. I don't think it's for a time, it was like the population of the world was like, it was steady and steady and steady, steady and steady, and a little bit, and a little bit, and a little bit. This is what it's done lately. All right. The goodness, the benevolence of man, or the godliness of man, it was never up here. Let's put it down. It's always been evil. But let's magnify real hard to the bottom, because let's just say man has always been way down here, not anywhere up here, because we are inherently sinful and evil. So let's just magnify real down to the bottom of that scale, and this is man now. That's where we're going. America is apostate. And we'll face the judgment of God because of it. We as a nation, I would say, in this life or the next. Next thing I want to consider from a practical standpoint is this. How do we deal with apostate teachers today? We expose them. We expose them and we avoid them based on their message. But we have no authority beyond that. We can't execute judgments that are designed for an Old Testament economy in the Promised Land for the people of Israel under the law of Moses as their constitution. We expose them and we avoid them, and I try to do that in this church. I really do. And I think as a body we try to do that. There are sometimes people who send me, hey, did you hear what so-and-so said last week? Did you hear what so-and-so's teaching now? And sometimes I'm like, I can't believe it. Yeah, I've heard about it. And sometimes I'm like, wait, what? Can you send me some information on that? Right? So we as a collective body, right, we're trying to do this. We're trying to expose, avoid, separate from false teachers. The principle of today's passage is clear, and that is this. All of this implies this main truth that I want you to take home. God demands exclusive worship. God demands exclusive worship, and he hates apostasy. Put that in your mind, because I didn't say that at one point throughout this message, and we didn't even really go there, but all of this points to that, does it not? God demands exclusive worship, and he hates apostasy. And so we need to make sure that we put him first in our lives. We need to make sure that our understanding of God is based on what he wrote in his book, not on subjective feelings or intuition or letting go and letting God. That's garbage. Or any other false teaching. But what God says, we need to make sure that nothing competes with what he says. We need to make sure that nothing competes with God as the priority in our lives. Thus, we need to be wholly committed to the Lord as our God, because God demands exclusive worship. God demands exclusive worship, and he hates apostasy. If you take your hymnals and turn to 635,